I want to thank y'all for having me. Thank you for that kind introduction, Melinda. And Mark, I want to thank you for the kind article about my family. Recently, we added, my wife and I have been married for 23 years, and we have 4 biologic children, but just last month we were in China, and where we adopted my newest member of our family, Boomer, from an orphanage there. It was quite interesting. There's an orphanage with 800 children, all with special needs, and he has Down syndrome, and his name is Boomer Greene. So we're excited about that. You know, I'm so proud to be on the Public Service Commission, and I still do my practice. I had surgery this morning. I see patients this afternoon, and people say, "How do you do it?" And I say, "Well, I just whatever's in front of me, I try to be very present." And I think it's important because I believe in citizen democracy, and I think we have a great system. But I think each of us need to take turns and revolve through the structure that we have. And that does come at some sacrifice. I give up seeing some patients. I give up some family time. I did get home the other night, and my kids go, "Dad, why are you so tired?" I said, "Well, I have 5 kids, 4 jobs, 5 kids, 4 dogs, 3 jobs, 2 boats, and 1 wife." And my wife said, "Oh, you put me last." I said, "Well, no, you're the only thing I have one of. It's like partridge in a pear tree, you know." So a little bit more about why I ran. I am grateful to have not had an opponent, and we got elected in October in the primary, and I think I try to do a thoughtful job of entering an issue, kind of peeling off the labels and the tribalism, and get to the heart of an issue, and as to what's best for the ratepayer and for Louisiana. I have a little bit of history of public service. My dad was Senator Tom Greene. He served in the late 90s, ran for governor, but then he went back to being a veterinarian. He was a veterinarian the whole time. He turned 70 last Friday, and he came from his vet practice, and we had him a little surprise party. My grandfather, who served, he not only in the Army, but he was the mayor of a small town, but mainly worked on the railroad. And the theme is public servant, not a lifelong politician. I think it's important. You know, I think about at my church, the people that complain the most about the sermon. And they're the ones that say the sermon was terrible. They're not helping with the chairs. They're not helping in the nursery. They're not helping anywhere. And I think that can be the same in our society, is you can easily complain about everything that's being done, but are you willing to jump in? I've described it like a plate of bacon and eggs. You see a plate of bacon and eggs, and you say, "Well, how did the bacon and the eggs get there?" Well, it was a chicken and a pig. And the chicken was involved, but the pig was committed. And I think if you ever decide to run for office, that enters into the level of commitment, because you got to give up certain things. You enter into the public eye. But you know what they taught us in the Navy is you're the top 1%. You're held to an unfair higher standard. And I think that people that do that realize that you can say it's unfair, but you're volunteering for that. And I think that's important. One of the things that what is our philosophy on the Public Service Commission? There's 2 drivers, if you will. It's reliability and affordability. And if you peel back reliability, as Bob and I were talking about, I think the true essence is honesty and transparency. And then ultimately, just when you turn the lights on, you want to know that they're going to come on. It's about electrons. And the question of how affordable can that be? And that uncovers a lot of questions about to what degree should we regulate free markets and with monopolies, and what about competition, and how does that impact? And I think that the structure in which we govern that is so important, because if it's drawn out and Louisiana backwoods politician brother-in-law deals, it's going to dissuade companies from wanting to come and invest in Louisiana. Ultimately, I ran for office because I got tired of Louisiana being last in so many things. Now, we're not last in electricity rates. We do really well with that. But we're also high on consumption. And so I think that we have to have a vision for the future. And what does that look like? Well, I heard recently that, I think it was Bill Gates that said that, you know, the problem with America, or looking through the lens of Louisiana, is that we govern on last year, 2017. And in China, they govern for 2037. When I was recently in Guangzhou, I was amazed that we were in one city with 19.5 million people. And they all have electricity, the sewage all goes somewhere, everybody's working. So I think that we should ask ourselves these probing questions to see how can we do better. And a lot of politicians can be myopic. They're myopic for their next election cycle. Well, this is not about me. This is how do we get Louisiana better for not just 2019, but 2037 and 2039. Mark and I were talking that our children are looking at colleges, and I would love for them to have Louisiana on the top of their list because of the shape that we can make it for the generation that comes after us. More specifically, on the Public Service Commission, what do we have to think about along those lines? We have a lot of generation that will probably, we need to think about transitioning to the next phase of what that looks like. Some of them are 30, 40, almost 50 years old. They're paid for, so that's nice, but how long are they going to last? And it's not free to build new ones. That comes when ratepayers. In that milieu of conversation, I think things that are important are who's bearing the risk? Does the benefit go to the ratepayer? Most ratepayers, they don't even know these meetings happen or what goes on there. And in my mind, I represent those ratepayers. And I think that they're very, very, very important concepts that are coming up. I think if you can't get electricity and you can't have water and waste, then how are you going to ever start a business? I was up in, I think telecommunications is very important. We had a meeting up in St. Francisville recently, and the children, a lot of them cannot do their homework at home because it's internet-based, and they don't have reliable phone and internet in some of the rural areas. So what would that infrastructure package look like to develop that? And I think we can't have all of the solutions, and we can't know all of that, the answers, until we know the extent of the problems. One of my favorite classes in business school was problem framing. And what you have to do in problem framing is you just pull a thread until either it comes out or it unravels. And part of that is hypothesis testing. Let's just keep asking questions until we get to the best final answer for now. There's a concept called marginal utility, and that is where on the curve can we get that's our maximum level of utility or happiness or usefulness, but that may be different 5 years from now than now. And thank you for democracy that we can continue to address those problems throughout time as they come. I think that cybersecurity is very important, and we're going to have continuing evolving issues with that we may not have had in the late 1990s. You know, speaking of time differences, one of my philosophies of governing is, I have to tell you a little story about it. A young man gets married, and his wife goes to cook a ham at Thanksgiving, and she cuts the two ends off the ham, puts it in a pot, puts it in the oven. And he says, "Why did you do that?" She says, "Well, that's the way my mom did it." And he foolishly says, "Is that the only reason?" She says, "Yeah." So they go to the mom's house later, and he said, "So I noticed that your daughter cuts the two ends off a ham, puts it in a pot, puts it in the oven. She said she does it that way because that's the way you did it. Why did you do it that way?" She goes, "That's the way my mom did it." So they go to the grandmother's house, and she wasn't cooking, but she said, "You know, look, your daughter, your granddaughter, they both cut the two ends off, put it in a pot, put it in the oven." They said, "That's the way you did it." She goes, "Oh, baby, back then we didn't have pots big enough." And I think that the takeaway from that little story is, you know what, we have different pots and pans right now. We also have different problems. In the late 80s, we didn't have a cybersecurity problem. We didn't have the internet just yet. So I think that we have to always constantly hypothesis test our own answers to say, well, how could this be better? And what are the obstacles to getting there? I think that there's a lot coming up on the commission that I'm excited to discuss with all parties involved, including my fellow commissioners, our staff. You know, I agree with Abraham Lincoln. He had a theory, or it was really a principle that in his leadership, that there's thesis, antithesis, synthesis. So I don't think we need to come in with this is the answer or else. But this answer starts a dialogue that we can get to the sharpest thought possible. And I think if we can get rid of some of the partisanship that anchors us, that we can get to the best possible answers for Louisiana moving forward. So with that, I just want to take some questions, and I will repeat the questions. So, Malin?
When you're talking about the big issues that are coming before the PSC, can you kind of give us a rundown of what you see as the major votes that are coming up in the next few months?
Yeah, so the question is, what are some of the major votes coming up before the commission in the next several months? I think that there's a lot going on with renewable portfolio standards. The question of where do renewables fit? We are a natural gas state. There's a lot of natural gas. Some say 250 years worth of natural gas. And that makes that very affordable for us. But where do renewables fit in? And I think it's a great question. I think that it also has to be an economic question. And I look at renewables like I used to look at flat screen televisions. They used to be prohibitively expensive. And through technology and time, now you can get them at Walmart for affordable. So I think that renewables should be part of our portfolio, but not a mandated part. And then it should make economic sense for the ratepayers to invest in that. I think another one is what does our next 50 years of generation look like? I mentioned some of the generation that's online right now is like an old car. How long is it going to last? But I don't want to buy a new one. Well, I think that we need to start asking those questions so that we don't have a shortage in a critical time. I think that we constantly have to be aware of the storms that come our way. We learned a lot from Katrina. We think we're ready now. I just read on the way here, I think there's a Cat 4 in the Atlantic that's not coming toward us, but who knows what that would be like in a week or two. So I think we have to constantly ask ourselves the what ifs. Yes, sir.
I'd like to ask you, what do you think about your fellow board members? You listed a variety of things that seem to be pretty standard, cost electricity, generating capacity in the future. But do you see them looking or willing to look outside the box, to be creative on a variety of different solutions that face the state?
So the question is, what do I think about my fellow board members? I think you mean commissioners, about the thinking outside of the box paradigm. In a way, I think that if there's one person that does, then the light comes on that they then have to answer those questions. I think what's very important is for the tone to be intelligent and respectful, even though disagreeable. I've heard recently that two of the most important factors for success, individual or corporate meaning community and everyone, is intelligence and conscientiousness. Conscientious being the will to do what's right in your environment. And so I think if we are constantly asking, digging, testing our hypotheses, then I'm going to probably ask them some tough questions about why they have that stance, and I expect them to ask me the same. And that can be done in a civil tone based on very thoughtful issues. It doesn't have to become so heated or antagonistic. So are they going to be open to it? I think they're going to have to answer one way or another, as will I if I'm asked such a question.
Go back to InterG's massive building projects, which you are going to be voting on in the next couple of months. They're replacing, about $19 billion worth of older generation. Should InterG be looking at merchant providers? Should they be looking at allowing some of the industrial customers to make their own electricity? Should they be looking at that sort of thing rather than building, $19 billion worth of brand new generation that I am going to have to pay for?
That's a good question. The question is, should InterG and let's say all energy providers be looking at alternative methods for electrons besides a massive outlay of capital nearing $19 billion? that summarize your question fairly well?
That's, yeah. Well, as someone who votes on it, will you be looking at
Oh, yes.
merchants allowing industrials to make their own, looking for different ways to trim down that $19 billion that the ratepayer, are going to have to pay for?
The answer to that is yes, because I think that everything should be on the table. And maybe on a routine or regular basis, let's look and see what is the best. And we get back to reliable and affordable. I think we have to prioritize reliability, but not far behind it is affordability. So if we're going to contemplate spending $19 billion on electrons, well, wait a minute, what are the other alternatives? And I don't think that we should make that decision without taking a deep dive into what those alternatives are. How reliable are they? How do they impact the ratepayer? And what is this going to look like in 5 years? So yes is the question. I think we should consider everything before making that big of a decision.
So you would be in favor of allowing the industrials to make their own electricity?
Well, so CoGeneration.
Cells off of the
Yeah, so
grid?
that's a conversation that I'm interested to know. How does that work in long term? And are they then subject to being an energy provider like the other energy providers? So I think the idea being is that there was a docket that was opened to start looking at that, and there needs to be a deeper dive into what does this look like? What are the needs of generation for Louisiana? And what are the possibilities that are out there that could meet that? And I think cogen is one of them. And then discovering, okay, what is the impact of other ratepayers? How reliable is it? And how are they treated fairly? So I think it's a good question that we don't have the answers to. But that is definitely going to be on the table for what's the best for Louisiana moving forward.
Recently, InterG, going back on InterG, they said they'd like to pass on the losses they sustained during the 2016 flood to its customers. How do you stand on that?
The question is, how do I stand on the InterG passing on its losses to the customers? I've heard rumors of that, but I've not met with them about that yet. I know in my own small business, if we have losses, and this is how most small businesses work, if you have insurance to cover those losses, then you file that through your own. I haven't talked to them specifically about it, but from the ratepayers side and who I represent, I don't understand yet how you would recover something that never actually happened. It's not the ratepayers' fault that the storms hit. So philosophically, I have a little problem with it, but they've not come to me for the ask.
First, congratulations on Boomer.
Thank you.
You mentioned cybersecurity a couple of times. That's a big word. Often kind of gets associated with governmental issues and big business issues, when it really gets more granular to how it affects us in a more simplistic way. So what is the Commissioner's role of cybersecurity? Does it fall under what y'all govern?
That's a good question. I don't know that I have the full answer for it. The question was, what is the PSC's role in cybersecurity? I think that it's almost like viruses, bacteria and infections and antibiotics. The bacteria seem to stay ahead of the antibiotics, and it seems like the hackers usually stay ahead of the agencies until they get caught, and then you flip them to work for you. But so obviously, if you have any nuclear facilities, then that's paramount. But otherwise, I think the potential for harm is so significant that using government resources to make sure that our cyber networks are safe, it's paramount. Most government agencies seem to be underfunded on most things. So for us to get the best and the brightest to stay a step ahead is challenging. But I will say it seems like most of the organizations, the energy providers, it's important for them too. And so they have a staff of cybersecurity teams that are working around the clock to prevent the worst possible.
Just to follow up on that, does the PSC have any sense of, how well is InterG's cybersecurity functioning? How well are these companies tracking and protecting their grids? Not necessarily that you would have your staff do it, but does the PSC have any sense of how well these companies are doing?
The question is, does the PSC have any sense of how well these companies are functioning at cybersecurity? I think that one of the important themes is something called red teaming. If they can constantly stress how good their systems are and report back to us. I don't know that the Public Service Commission is equipped to stress their systems, but we need to know from them how safe it is, and please be honest with us, and what do you need from us to make it safe. So I would say at this point that the Public Service Commission doesn't have somebody that we say, hey, go try to sneak into their system. We ask them constantly, how good is it, what's lacking, how can we help?
Japan's nuclear meltdown had lots of similarities to Louisiana, where the water was only just a few feet from the nuclear reactors. Yet the private company initially stalled, and then the government agencies later said they just didn't have a clue. You're on the Public Service Commission. We have the Mississippi River, we have the nuclear power plants. Are you going to do anything to look into whether or not we should have septic pumps for the state of Louisiana in case something of that nature happened?
The question is, am I going to do anything on the Public Service Commission to look into the vulnerability of nuclear given our proximity to water? Is that a fair question? A summary of your question? I think our water drainage systems have had a lot of scrutiny, especially in New Orleans recently. And I think that we should constantly look at that. What is the worst possible scenario for nuclear? What is the worst possible scenario for fill in the blank? And how do we react to that so that we're not surprised when it does? There are various reasons to improve the water drainage of South Louisiana. And we have to constantly ask ourselves, what pots and pans do we have that are available to make that even better? Meanwhile, I think that there's new developments in nuclear. There's the stackable small cell nuclear, and nuclear has always been a little more expensive, or quite a bit more expensive. That makes it, how great is that option? But to answer your question, I think that we should look at that constantly.
Do you think the commission has done something on that, independent of the federal and the private companies?
I do not think that we have.
Thank you.
Can you help us understand why ratepayers should be paying franchise fees of electric utilities, telephone companies, cable companies, when they don't benefit from holding a monopoly franchise? It's the companies that benefit from holding a monopoly franchise.
The question is, why should ratepayers pay franchising fees for expanding utilities that have a monopoly? Is that right? I'll tell you, I don't know the answer to that question. That's the first time I've ever received that question, but I can certainly look into it and get back to you. I would explore both sides and see what the upside and downside are, but I have to tell you, I don't know the answer to that question right now.
Would you view that as just another means of passing on costs that are legitimately that of the business rather than those of the ratepayer?
Yeah, that's a good question. So whenever anyone comes to us with a rate increase, my question is why? And what we have to ask them, and it's usually layered in their response, is this to try to just maintain rates or increase rates? And it usually is. And so the ultimate question is, how is this going to benefit the ratepayer? And it has to be in the vibe of reliability. And so if someone comes to me and says, hey, we want to increase our rates for fill in the blank, it starts a litany of questions that say, what happens if we don't increase these? Does the ratepayer, are they going to have a blackout at a certain time? Or even worse, like California, a brownout? The summers are getting hotter and the winters are getting colder, it seems. And so utility companies are making a lot of money when that happens, but they also have to use a lot of generation. So if their primary answer is because we're going to franchise, that's probably not a good enough answer for me as to the sole reason to raise rates.
Do you think that the State Public Service Commission should have control over internet throttling, considering much of our state has maybe one high-speed supplier?
The question is, do I think that the Public Service Commission should have oversight over internet throttling, given that there's one spot that has...
In many places, only have one high-speed supplier.
Yeah. You know, I know that before Congress soon is going to be should Google be regulated, Facebook be regulated. Again, back to the pots and pans, we didn't have this problem in 1985. So I think the conversation is worthy to have, and it should be very heated. And we should look at what are the ups and what are the downs, and is this what about free speech? What about overregulation? And I get all of those, but seeing that there's also some downsides that were never anticipated prior to as much technology as we have now, I think it's an incredible conversation we should have.
You talked about internet access and broadband access, and I remember this was an issue several years ago. I mean, what has the Public Service Commission's position been lately on access to broadband internet, and has the commission taken any action to try and expand that access?
The question is, what has the commission done to expand broadband access throughout the state? So we recently were in St. Francisville, and they have a problem, like I mentioned, with the kids not able to do their homework, but that also spills over into the sector of emergency services and 911. I think that this is going to be an interim conversation, because I think, especially with the T-Mobile and Sprint merger, they claim to have future capacity for cellular coverage at speeds probably faster than some broadband, and 100% of continental United States coverage. And I think others will soon follow. AT&T was very helpful with the community there as much as they could be, but the bottom line is that to get to the rural sectors, it takes money for the infrastructure to get there. Congress has some solutions that we could tap into, but that still requires local resources. I think fiber is going to be incredible. It already is in Lafayette. It's got a lot of great solutions for us. So I think the best times are ahead of us with regards to that. And it's just a matter of how do we get from here to there, and that's both cellular and broadband.
But has the PSC identified any available funds that could be used to help in that regard?
Yes, Congressman Abraham has led a lot in that area, and there's money available there that he's been very helpful with. As a matter of fact, with the St. Francisville, and if there's any others, let me know how my office can help. Because if we package it right before the ask, then we could say, here's the problem, here's the economic impact, this is what it costs, and so there are solutions out there, and I'd like to be part of the resource for that. It's not directly through me, but I have a great relationship with Congressman Abraham, who has led that charge. I think in general, if we can continue to aptly identify the problems that are coming before us, that right now there's an exciting number of potential solutions that we need to go thesis, antithesis, synthesis on to get to what's the best for Louisiana in the next 5, 10, 20 years.
As a practicing physician as well as an educator and someone with a resume that might be the highlight for multiple individuals, do you find that Louisiana with the doctor shortage has a capacity to increase the number of doctors coming from our medical schools? Do we have the student body applying that could dramatically increase our doctors?
So the question is, do we in Louisiana have the capacity to increase the number of physicians that we have? I was visiting this morning with one of my partners, and his son is doing the college tours, and his son, who's a senior, is asking the colleges, what is your acceptance rate into medical school? Do you have research for me to do there? Do you have a direct pathway for me to get there? I know that when I was coming through the training system, 95% of doctors ended up living nearly permanently within a 95-mile radius of where they did their residency. And so I think things that are important to where doctors are going to live, one of my senior partners said, live where you have good partners and your wife wants to live, because all patients are patients. I moved back home. I'm from Maringouin, Louisiana. I lived in New Orleans for 4 years, Temple, Texas, the Texas A&M system at that time for 5 years, and Seattle, Washington for a year. And I probably could have gone anywhere, but I wanted to come home. And I think there's a lot to home. I love Louisiana. I love Baton Rouge. I've got 4 siblings. There's 5 of us. We have 21 grandchildren, and we all live 7 miles apart. So I think that in order to get doctors to come here, the things like education, tax structure, all of that are probably ahead of how many med students can we get accepted, because if we increase that number, we still don't know where they're going to train. We want them to come back here, but I can't speak to the number of medical students that the schools accept each year. I think we probably could use more medical schools or students. Healthcare is around 19% of our national GDP, and I think having more to help would be great.
I think you missed the point of my question. You mentioned you're from here and many doctors are from here, and they stay close to the medical school they went to. Does Louisiana have the capacity to increase the number of doctors graduating from our medical schools, which would, if they stay within 95 miles of where they train, would that allow us to increase our number of doctors because we have a severe shortage?
So the question is, does Louisiana have the capacity to increase the number of doctors graduating?
I guess you could almost say, are kids smart enough, the ones that are applying for medical school and can't get in?
Oh, I think they're very smart. I think it's gotten very competitive. I would answer that not through the Public Service Commission.
I don't mean that. Right.
And I think that it's important that it does grow, and I believe in incrementalism, so it doesn't have to double overnight, but I think it needs to be based on our need, the people that want to do it, and the services provided as a calling. So I would think that yes, we have the ability to do that, and it's through the government, but also through the colleges that grant how many students come out. So I think it has to be a joint effort based on the need from the communities.